Our guest today is Professor Caroline Winter. She is the William R. Coe Professor of History at Stanford University and a recipient of the American Ingenuity Award from the Smithsonian Institution for mapping the social network of Benjamin Franklin. She's authored several books, including the prize-winning book, The Culture of Classicism, Ancient Greece and Rome in American Intellectual Life, and her forthcoming book is Time in Maps, From the Age of Discovery to Our Digital Era. She's an elected fellow of the Society for American Historians and the American Antiquarian Society. The book that we'll be discussing today is her book, American Enlightenments, Pursuing Happiness in the Age of Reason. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here. Professor Winter, welcome. It's fantastic to have you on the program.
Thank you. It's really great to be here today.
All right, I really enjoyed reading this book. This was an absolutely fascinating book. And I always like to kick off the conversation here on Book Breaks by asking, what inspired it? Why did you feel it was important to write? And the title, it's very subtle to notice, but it's not The American Enlightenment, it's American Enlightenments. Can you expand on that, please?
Yeah, sure. I'll take the first part of your question first, which is why did I write this book? And, I really wrote this book for my students and because of my students. So as you can imagine, I teach American history before the Civil War, mostly the history of ideas. And this period in the 18th century is such a critical time period. There's so many exciting things that happen, the American Revolution and scientific changes and all of that. And I kept assigning the surveys of this era that were written in the 1970s. And these were very wonderful books in their time. Henry May's book on the American Enlightenment, and there's a couple other ones, and there's nothing wrong with them. It's just that 30 or 40 years later, or maybe even that's 50 years later now, they were not speaking to my students anymore. They were in fact putting them to sleep. The issues that were really animating my students and getting them excited about history were not the concerns of that time period, which was really the Cold War era. So I thought, you know what? I gotta write the book that my students want to read. I have to engage with what it is that they are thinking about today. So that's why this book came out. And so it's meant to be assigned in classrooms. I wrote it to be assigned in classrooms. So I tried to make complicated ideas seem to be somehow accessible to students. And that's where that funny title comes from, right? It's not The American Enlightenment, it's American Enlightenments. And that's because the term The American Enlightenment was a product of the Cold War era, when Americans were very fearful about the rise of totalitarian regimes in the Soviet Union and elsewhere in Europe. And they imagined, this is like 1945 to 1975, they imagined that the founding era of American history, the 18th century, would form this kind of ideological bomb shelter, against Soviet-style totalitarianism. And that's when they invented that term, the American Enlightenment. Like if we can wrap ourselves in the American Enlightenment, those horrible totalitarian ideas will not infect us. But what I found when I actually listened to the people who lived in the 18th century, instead of imposing our own modern ideas on the Enlightenment, was that they never used the term the American Enlightenment. They had a much more subtle and inchoate sense of what it meant to become enlightened. And so they had a lot of different paths toward enlightenment. And so the term American Enlightenments came from the 18th century itself, rather than being imposed 200 years later by a modern historian.
And it's like sometimes like a little bit of a stereotype way of thinking is when we think of the Enlightenment, we have like these powdered wigs and thinkers, and they're coming up with all these fantastic ideas, that all these marvelous, fantastic ideas, pursuit of happiness. But reading through the book, it was fascinating to read actually how ambiguous a lot of the legacies of the Enlightenment are, and how contradictory some of the ideas are. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, well, as you just mentioned, I sort of expected when I went back into the 18th century, you know, guided by these Cold War books, which told me that there was this very strong and like very clear sense of the Enlightenment. I went back into the 18th century looking for that, and I couldn't find it anywhere. And what instead I found were definitely a lot of people in powdered wigs. They were still there, but people who were very unsure about what it was they were doing. And we're not just talking your basic farmhand being unsure, right? We're talking people like James Madison and Thomas Jefferson being unsure of what it is that they were doing and whether enlightenment would ever be achieved. And to me, that, I mean, that really spoke to me because I'm unsure, right? I have all these ideas all the time, but I really don't know if they're good ideas or not good ideas. And I thought that it was so humanizing of the 18th century that, you know, one of the things that the Cold War era of scholarship gave us, and this is actually embodied in this wonderful painting that our audience today can go Google after I'm done, but it's a painting of the signing of the Constitution that was made in 1940. And it's like super sure, bathed in glory and holy light and all of those things. That's not how it was. We don't actually have any pictures of the signing of the Constitution. What I found in the 18th century was a bunch of people who were unsure of everything, including whether revolting against Britain as an act of enlightenment was a good idea at all. And I just thought this rehumanizes the founders for us. It takes them off the pedestal, not in order to ridicule them, not in order to crush them under our feet, not in order to sort of hurl insults at them, but instead to see them as other human beings who, like us, are confronted with a world that is ambiguous and where there's too much information. We don't know how to make sense of it, but we're trying, you know, we're trying. So the book that I wrote is of a bunch of people trying to make sense of a world in which, you know, the bottom is dropping out of all of the things that made it certain for them. They're not sure whether monarchy has been a good idea, but that's been around for 3,000 years. And suddenly Thomas Paine comes along and says, you know, maybe not. God, you know, who knows? So a lot of the certainties that had allowed people to believe in the world of 1730 or 1630 were now under dispute. And this was as destabilizing for them as it would have been for us. So I wanted to capture that in the book.
And one of the first chapters is the seashells on the mountaintops there. And it was just fascinating because reading through it, it's like you realize actually what a giant shift in thinking that people had to start thinking differently, that maybe not everything is literal in the Bible, and you can almost hear the hints of early scientific thought. And then the later chapter on religion, the idea of natural laws and God being expressed in the natural world. Can you talk a little bit more about how important religion played in the Enlightenment, the shift kind of away from it, but also how it still kept a hold on people as well?
Yeah, you know, religion, I'm glad you brought this up because it's a common misconception about the 18th century and the time, you know, we still call the Enlightenment, right? Is that somehow they kind of anticipating Nietzsche said, you know, God is dead, right? But 100 years earlier and off they marched into secularism. But in fact, what they really did was to just reimagine God and his place in the world. And they tried to accommodate the idea of a supernatural deity, you know, that we can't see with or feel with our senses with the scientific revolution. So they come up with a kind of compromise, right? And they say, well, you know, God is out there, but he doesn't operate in our daily life through miracles anymore. That's sort of superstitious. Instead, we can imagine that at some point long ago and far away, God set the world and the universe into motion according to the laws that Isaac Newton has now found for us, right? There's, the law of thermodynamics, et cetera. And we can imagine that this benevolent God essentially imagined science into being. So by worshiping science and nature, by examining science and nature, it's a new way of worshiping God. So you can still go to worship God in a church, and many people continue to do so. But you can now, like the people who climbed into the Appalachians looking for fossil seashells, you can now worship God by looking at his creation. And as probably some of your listeners are imagining, this opens the door to transcendentalism, which really gets going about 50 years later to people like Thoreau and Emerson, who really kind of puncture the boundaries between the natural worlds, the world of trees and rocks and plants, and God himself. And we see this also in the Hudson River School landscape painters. But it's really the people of the 18th century, the first people who call themselves enlightened, who begin to try to reconcile the idea of a regular universe operating according to laws of nature with the idea of God. And one of the other things that they open the door to is the idea that God is benevolent. And they get rid of the God of Abraham, the punishing God of the Puritans. And they open us to, the idea that we all deserve to be happy and that is what God wants for us. So then you can, fast forward to the 21st century, the self-help movements and all of the things that we do today. But it's really the people in my book, American Enlightenments, who begin to imagine themselves toward that new world, that God speaks to us through nature, and that it is by studying nature that we worship God and that we try to understand him.
And another theme kind of building off of that I found fascinating was how British Americans turning themselves into independent Americans were having to find new ways of building an identity for themselves. And one of my favorite chapters in the book was the one on the Aztecs, this fascinating idea of they were still looking down on native people in North America as incapable of civilization. And then the Europeans thinking, well, you can't, obviously it shows that you can't have an independent civilized nation in the Americas. But then these American thinkers turning to the Aztec Empire and all the legacies of the Aztec Empire from the codices and the calendar as a justification, saying, well, there was an enlightened civilization. We can build one as well. Can you expand a little bit more on that, please?
Yeah, well, I'm so delighted to hear that you liked the chapter on the Aztecs, because that was one of my favorites to write. I'm just fascinated by the Aztecs and the Maya and the Olmec, and in another life, I would be a Latin American archaeologist. But yeah, one of the lost, there's so much about the 18th century that's lost, but one of the lost aspects of the 18th century is what was called the debate about the New World. And basically for about 200 or 300 years, European philosophers had been saying, everything degenerates in the New World because it has a really foul climate. It's cold and humid. And so all life forms degenerate there, animals, plants, and humans. And that's how they justified what they saw as the, quote, barbarity or savagery of the Indians. They could not understand why the Indians of North America would choose a life of hunting and gathering rather than of building cities like Paris, for example. This was a huge problem for the American revolutionaries, and they dwelled on it constantly because, they were getting this poison poured in their ears by Montesquieu and others. And they said, look, we founded this new nation, the United States, and now you keep telling us that we're just going to degenerate here in the climate of the New World and that our new nation is never going to amount to anything. We're all going to start becoming smaller and weaker, and eventually we'll all shrivel into reptiles. So that is why they held up the Aztecs. who had built this magnificent city of Tenochtitlan, and, you know, tried to fight off this Spanish invader, it's not because they like loved the Aztecs because they were modern day anthropologists, right? They saw in the Aztecs the way to combat this European idea that everything degenerates in the New World. So they said, look at the Aztecs. They built Tenochtitlan. This was a city that in 1492 was larger and more populous than any city in Europe. It was like the Venice of the New World. Absolutely magnificent city. We can do that again. This is the kind of thing that we can do in the New World. So don't you Europeans go telling us that we will now degenerate. So Jefferson acquires all of these books for his own library, for the Library of Congress, that teach the American people about the Aztecs in order to give them the self-confidence to build what is going to be, you know, another way of thinking about it is the new Rome, right? They want to build the new Rome. They want to be as great as this other civilization.
And then kind of going back to the theme of contradiction and ambiguity, then on the other hand, for counting the native people and the fact that this whole concept of they weren't able to achieve a significant population density and then weren't able to build a proper civilization, then almost justified the colonial expansion and pushing native people to the periphery. Can you expand on that?
Yeah. So that's the chapter on counting the Indians, which is really about the modern science of statistics and population. And this was a huge concern in the 18th century. I know everybody out there sees those signs, as I do, that we're all supposed to fill out the census, right, for 2020. And the federal census was this huge issue, but it was also ideologically charged, because in order to count people, you have to decide who to count. And they couldn't decide whether or not to count the American Indians because they couldn't decide whether they were part of the United States or not. And the problem with the Indians, in their view, was that they were not fully civilized. And how did they know that they were not fully civilized? Because their population density, like the number of people per square mile, was not dense enough to create the kinds of cities that showed that you were civilized. And so I felt it was very important to talk about how this science of population and statistics, which calls itself enlightened in the 18th century, and, you know, out of which the federal census emerges, has real dark sides to it. You know, we always have to be thinking about the legacy of the Enlightenment. And one of the legacies of the Enlightenment is making these distinctions between what kinds of people we do count and what kinds of people we don't count, and the purposes for which we count them. So as we debate the federal census today, it has its roots in the Enlightenment. And it is a way of showing that the sciences of mathematics and counting and the statistical use of government data, these can be used for good, but they can also have these negative side effects. Which is what Europeans believe about their own Enlightenment. So, you know, Americans are very proud of their Enlightenment in the 18th century because they associate it with the founding of the Republic. And they say, oh, the Enlightenment brought us, you know, the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. And these are wonderful statements of human rights and liberation. By contrast, people in Europe often see the end point of the Enlightenment as being the concentration camps of the Nazis, which also involved statistical calculations, counting certain populations and not others, forming coherent groups of people. And these kinds of programs, they trace to the very kinds of population statistical methods that were developed during the 18th century. So we have a very different relationship toward our Enlightenment. I mean, you know, the Enlightenment as it played out in North America, than many modern Europeans do, who find these regimes of human categorization, of human counting, of the government use of statistical data about human populations to have led to some of the worst abuses of human rights in the history of the world. And they're very, very concerned about the legacies of the Enlightenment. So it's really, really different, you know, when you cross the Atlantic to see how modern people, as in like people like us today, look back on the legacies of 250 years ago.
And then kind of going on from that, the other chapter that was very powerful was the one on slavery. And actually, the way I read it, how ambiguous the legacy of Enlightenment is for how they approached slavery, how they thought about it, religion versus political, and Montesquieu having this great argument of it, that political systems are man-made, slavery is man-made, so we can fix it and change it. But then looking back also to the ancient world and saying, well, they were enlightened back then and they had slaves, and that the Enlightenment was even used to help justify slavery at times. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So I expected to go back into the 18th century and find what I see as sort of like the way most people understand the relationship between slavery and enlightenment, which is that enlightened people woke up one day and said, slavery is awful. It's a scourge upon humanity. And it's awful because it hurts people. It's physically painful and it's morally bankrupt. Okay, so I expected there to be a one-to-one correlation between abolitionism and people who wanted to become enlightened. There were people who thought that way, who said, you know, slavery is a scourge upon humanity. We need to get rid of it, and we need to get rid of it now. Uncompensated, immediate abolition, yeah. But there were actually many, many other strands along the lines that you suggested of people who thought that they were enlightened, that they wanted to use. So let me just throw out a working definition of enlightenment for our listeners today. Is using human reason to make the world a better place. That's the like basic definition of enlightenment, using human reason to make the world a better place. So it means that you believe in the idea of progress, which is also new in the 18th century. But there were a lot of people who said, oh yeah, I want to use human reason to make the world a better place. So I have 200 slaves, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start treating them better. I'm not going to emancipate them, because I need them to work on my plantation. And I don't think that a post-emancipation society is one that I want to live in, because then we have freed slaves living all around us in a very dangerous state of, anger toward their former slaveholders. So what I want to do is either emancipate slaves and colonize them elsewhere. This was Thomas Jefferson's view, and he imagined himself to be enlightened. Or I'm going to hang on to my slaves, but I'm not going to beat them as often. I'm going to tell my overseer not to beat the slaves as often, because it's cruel to beat slaves. But it had nothing to do with emancipation. I have to say, I was shocked when I saw that, using human reason to make the world a better place is, on the one hand, a very specific program, but it leaves a lot of room for interpretation. And there were a lot of Southern slaveholders who imagined themselves to be enlightened, and who thought that they were treating their slaves in enlightened ways.
And then the other chapter that I found really fascinating was the one on republics versus monarchy, and this idea that almost the American Enlightenment and sprung forth on its own, and it was so much superior to these backward ancient monarchies in Europe. But so much of the intellectual legacy was patronized by European monarchs. You mentioned Caroline II, the wife of George II, and then the fascinating comparison of King George III and our George Washington, and then George III being the most educated monarch to sit on the British throne. Can you talk about some of that, the complexity in trying to shift away from like monarchy bad and republic good, but still needing all that patronage from the monarchies?
Yeah, So that was another fun chapter to write, because it was, really, this is an unexamined truth that is taught to every single American school child, including to me, which is that it is automatically the case that kingless republicanism is better than monarchy. And this is like not necessarily been proven, right? So Americans get rid of their king in 1776, and the text that really helps them to do that is Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which is like super radical, right? Because he comes along and he mocks kings and says the king is the principal ruffian of some restless gang. And it opens the door to this radically new idea that Americans have, that they're going to build a new republic without a king, which of course leaves them scrambling to think of something better. So they imagine the American presidency in Article 2 of the US Constitution and give him more power on paper than the King of Britain actually has. So this is something for all of you to think about today as well. But it is not, the chapter was fun to write because it is not in fact the case that it is obvious that a republic is more enlightened than a monarchy, and Americans knew it. And so there's this extraordinary moment in the US House of Representatives in 1796 where they're debating the idea. Literally, they're spending the day debating the idea of whether it's okay to say to the Europeans, who all have monarchs still, very powerful monarchs with huge armies behind them. Napoleon is just like waiting in the wings at this point. And they're saying the United States is more enlightened than Europe because we're a republic. But nowhere do they have any proof to show that that is the case. There is no federally funded university. There still isn't. There is very little support for public education. The list could go on and on and on. The big, great museums and scientific societies are in Europe. The big symphonies are in Europe. They have absolutely no proof for this cockamamie idea they have that republics are somehow inherently more enlightened than monarchies. So instead of just sort of automatically agreeing with the Americans because I'm American, I just decided to sort of leave the question open and say, look at all of the ways in which Americans, in fact, acknowledged that monarchies were the source of enlightenment in the 18th century. And that's where Queen Caroline comes into action. She's the queen consort of George II, who's the longest reigning monarch during the American colonial period. He reigns from 1727 to 1760, so that's 33 years. And she builds all these libraries, she writes poetry, she encourages science, she encourages smallpox inoculation, so she's a pro-vaxxer right before this is even a thing. And Americans acknowledge that she is a source of enlightenment. And yet somehow with Republican Revolution in 1776, this all has to get sort of thrown away. So I really wanted to, like an archaeologist, kind of resurrect a moment in the American past that the revolutionaries themselves wanted to bury because it was inconvenient for their argument that republicanism was inherently more enlightened than monarchism. And I would just add to that, I know everyone thinks that I'm a monarchist now, and I'm not, I assure you. I'm not a monarchist, but there are real, what's the word I'm looking for? It is a problem to get rid of a monarch as your figurehead for your nation, because you get rid of the charismatic full humanity of the symbol of the nation. So you're left with a flag, right? Which is sort of like a piece of cloth, right? It's sort of boring in comparison to a monarch who can fully inhabit the role. And I think that actually the reason that so many Americans follow the British royal family with such great interest today is because of a hunger for that charisma that monarchy always provided, and that Republican revolution had to get rid of, but never found a way to replace. So the chapter was really a kind of way to be a little bit impish and impudent, and to get people to rethink some of their pieties about what it means to be enlightened in America.
And through the whole book, the figure of Thomas Jefferson, I kind of feel, in some ways, he seems to embody this American Enlightenments and a lot of the contradictions to it. Writer of our Declaration of Independence, but a slave owner and continued to own slaves. Can you talk a little bit more about Thomas Jefferson in these American Enlightenments?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought him up because I remember a point halfway through writing the book where I went to one of my colleagues in despair and said, Thomas Jefferson is threatening to hijack my whole book. This is just going to be a book about Thomas Jefferson because he says all these things in exactly the way that you present. He is a figure of great contradiction. He says one thing, he does another, et cetera, et cetera. We all know this from a lot of the wonderful recent scholarship on Jefferson. And yeah, so in some ways he sort of embodies what I wanted to get at in the book. But I do wish that there had been more people who had been so good at revealing those contradictions, which is that the aspiration toward enlightenment is a contradiction because it is such a human process. We want to make the world a better place, but we don't know how to do it. We don't know how to measure our progress. We don't even know if progress is a thing. And our own self-interest, in his case, his slave plantation for one, our own self-interest gets wrapped up in our desire to help other people. So how do we balance that constant battle between what we know is good for everybody else and what we want for ourselves and our immediate family? Yeah, his writing is real. I always tell my students that all writing is the externalization of an internal drama. So when you're writing even the driest piece of academic prose, you're always bringing yourself to the page, you're always thinking about the things that are meaningful to you as a human being, as a citizen. And that's why we're all interested in different things as historians, because knowledge doesn't exist out there. It always comes through us as individuals. And I think that Thomas Jefferson ends up playing a big part in this book, even though I kept on trying to, like whack-a-mole, down you go, Tom, because his own writing is the externalization of an internal drama, of someone who is visibly struggling with that aspiration to the noblest of human endeavors while constantly being, pulled in these other directions. So even the final letter that he writes, practically on his deathbed in 1826, which is the final quotation in the book. And, he says, all eyes are opening to the rights of man. We deserve better than to be booted and spurred, by the grace of God. But we're not there yet. We're not there yet. And I thought, yeah, he nailed it. We keep trying, but we're not there yet.
And then, I would love to keep talking the whole day about this, but the questions from the audience are pouring in. So this is going to be my final question. The majority of our audience are teachers and students, and all the ideas covered in this book and all the complexity around it are so incredibly important to us as citizens, as Americans, and just looking at our nation's past. What advice would you have for teachers and students at looking at this period, covering these complex ideas, a lot of the nuance and subtlety in a lot of these ideas without judging them too harshly and looking at them fully and really fleshing them out?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question because, as a historian who studies a lot of elites in the 18th century, this comes up a lot, right? A lot of them say things that we think are really awful today, right? Like those slaveholders who called themselves enlightened. and didn't free their slaves. So what I say to my students is that we have a duty as citizens, and that is to make the world a better place. And we do that by marching in the streets and by voting at the ballot box or by running for public office. And those are absolutely vital to our democracy, to participate, to right the wrongs of the past. Okay, but we have a separate duty as historians and as scholars. And that duty is to try as much as we can to suspend our modern views and to go into the past and to try to understand on their terms what they were trying to say in the way that we would want people living 300 years from now to understand us. You know, maybe everybody's going to live on the planet Saturn in 300 years, and they'll judge us for not having realized how great it was to live on the planet Saturn. And, you know, we would look at that, you and I, and say, well, that's not really fair. You know, we weren't even thinking about Saturn really. So like, whatever. So what I say to my students is, using the metaphor of the treasure box and the flashlight, we're often taught to look at the past as a treasure box, that we take things out of it and we look at them and we decide whether we like them or not. We shouldn't do that. What we should do instead is to go into the past with a flashlight and to use the flashlight to illuminate the lives of other people who are so far away from us in time that they're almost like aliens on another planet. You know, we delude ourselves when we think that we can ever understand this. So we need to modestly pick up our flashlight and pick up the scraps, the tiniest scraps of evidence, to try to make the larger world that they left to us in these little scraps as best we can. But we should never judge when we are historians, because we ourselves would not want to be judged by future historians. We would want to be understood. And I think that the greatest gift that the historian can give to the past is to understand. And that's much, much harder than judging. So that's what I would say for, you know, teachers who are bravely teaching this complicated period of American ideas. You know, it's hard to teach the ideas of the 18th century. A lot of them are really weird and like so distant from us. But if we can just even try to understand them rather than judge them, we've already gone a long way.
Well, Professor Winter, thank you so much. I'm going to hand you over to Allison, and she's going to ask you all these fantastic questions from the audience.
Yes, there were so many that were coming in. It was hard to choose just a handful, but I will start with the first question. The first question comes from Matthew, and Matthew asks, did happiness, as in the pursuit of happiness, mean the same thing to Jefferson and his contemporaries that it means to us?
Ooh, thank you for asking this great question. No, it meant something different. So it's really ironic that that is probably the most famous sentence that comes to us from the 18th century, that we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So today, happiness means like personal happiness. You know, I am happy if I have a BMW. I don't, but I would be happy if I had a BMW. Or I'm happy that I went running this morning, blah, blah, blah. So in the 18th century, they also had that idea of personal happiness, but they had another idea of what they called social or public happiness, by which they meant the whole society being in a state of protection against external enemies and internal like civil war. So that's what Jefferson means in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's much closer to the meaning of the modern term national security than like BMW happiness. So we need to remind ourselves that the Declaration of Independence is a document written in a state of war for a young nation that is at war, and that they're trying to sort of figure their way through this very pragmatic and dangerous international situation. So, but when we as Americans today look back on that and say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it's a reminder that the founders were thinking about all of society as the duty of every citizen to look out for, not just buying a BMW.
Thank you. A nice 18th century BMW would be
That's
right.
Right.
Interesting. Next question comes from Stephanie, who is a European history teacher in Lisbon, Portugal. Stephanie asks, how do Enlightenment ideals in the US compare to the original ideals in Europe?
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. So there are some Enlightenment ideas that are hatched in Europe and that basically get on a ship and cross the Atlantic and come to the United States. So Montesquieu's idea of the separation of powers would be an example of that. But what I argue in this book is that actually a number of ideas are created as part of a transatlantic conversation. So a lot of European ideas about economics and like Thomas Malthus's idea about population, these come because of data that comes from the Americas. They come from military counts of the American Indians. They come from understandings of slavery, et cetera, and that those are transferred into the working habits of European philosophers. What I can say is that that is one direction in which European scholars can do more work, is in acknowledging the ways in which American ideas, and by American, I don't just mean North America, I also mean Spanish and Portuguese America, that those ideas were transferred into Europe to become part of European Enlightenment ideas. So I really see it as a big transatlantic conversation more than European ideas coming into the US or the Americas. But there were definitely some that just sort of like arrived and Americans just said, yeah, that's a great idea. Like Newton, for example. Newton's optics, Americans love it. They think it's great, they adopt it, no problem.
Excellent. Our next question is from Daryl from Chicago. Daryl asks, did the American Enlightenments only focus on reason, or did the American thinkers and politicians also see Enlightenment as having an emotional or passionate component?
Yes, Daryl, thank you for that question. Yeah, so what they called the passions or the senses, that was a huge part of the American Enlightenment and the Enlightenment more generally. And that's reflected in the title for, just to take one example, of Thomas Paine's Common Sense from 1776. So the title does not mean common sense in the way that we mean it today, like, you know, look both ways before you cross the street. That's just common sense. What he means is that we all have 5 senses through which we get data, and we all have that in common. We share a common sense, and that sensory data comes into our bodies and affects our reason and our emotions and our passions, and we respond to that. For example, by noticing that kings are a really bad idea, which is what he argues in the book. But when he uses the word sense, he's really channeling that kind of passionate part of the Enlightenment. And I would also say, actually, another place you can find it, weirdly enough, is the Declaration of Independence. Americans suffer in 3 ways in the Declaration of Independence. We often focus on the happiness part, which is an emotion, but one of the arguments that is made in the Declaration is that the American people are suffering. They are suffering physically, they are suffering emotionally, and that is a justification for revolution. So it's all over the place. The more you look, the more you find.
Find the unmute button. Our next question comes from Laura, and Laura asks, depending on where people lived in colonial America, did their opinions differ? Specifically, did the people who lived in large cities such as Boston or Philadelphia differ from those who lived in forts on the frontier?
So yes, short answer to that is yes, you can find different opinions depending on where you are looking. I would kind of caution us that at this point, the things that we call cities are like glorified towns. So the largest city in North America is Philadelphia. It only has about 30,000 people, which is like half the size of the student population at UC Berkeley across the bay. And that a lot of the thinkers that we associate with the center of the Enlightenment in America are people who lived on slave plantations, or in the case of John Adams, on a farm. So, and sectional boundaries are not solidly defined now in the way that they would be by the 1840s and 1850s. So I did not push really hard on regional variations in this book. It's more of a thematic book, just because, you know, the peopling of America is still such an inchoate thing at the end of the 18th century. Much more important actually was whether people had spent any time in Europe, in the large cities of Europe, to try to understand sort of European currents of thought. So you could take someone like Benjamin Franklin. He spent the last third of his life in London and Paris. So we think of him as a kind of archetypally American figure. And if you wanted to assign a region to him, you could say, well, you know, Philadelphia, he embodies the ideas of 18th century Philadelphia, but what he actually embodies are the ideas of 18th century London, and then the ideas of 18th century Paris. So for this book, you know, you could write a book that does what you are asking about, but for my particular book, the regional variations in America were less important than essentially regional variations in Europe. Great question though.
So an absolutely perfect and unplanned segue leads us to our question from Lois, who is in Oregon. And Lois asks, which country, France or Britain, more influenced the founders like Franklin in this American age of enlightenment?
Yeah, I love that. And you know, you could also add other countries, Spain and Italy and Germany to some extent. So France and Britain both had a huge influence on American thought in the 18th century. And the more you look, the more vast that influence becomes. And it sort of depends on which strand of thought you're looking at. So for the sciences, for certain sciences in the 18th century, Britain is very important. But I would immediately have to retract that, because then I would look at all the sciences going on in France. Let me try to sort of make a solid statement from that nimbus of generalities that I just gave you. What really shifts toward the 18th century is that France becomes a nest of political and social radicalism. And as the French Revolution that starts in 1789 approaches, if you are an American and you want to read the most extreme version of any idea that is out there, whether it's in religion or economics or love, you would want to open a French book, because the French Revolution unleashes this kind of radicalism in a way that Britain not only does not do, but in fact actively pulls back from in figures like Burke in the 1790s. So, but they're both really, really influential, and they continue to be over the course of the 19th century. You know, this is one of the extraordinary ironies of the American Revolution, is that, you know, they're all happy to get rid of their king in 1776 and have their little republic, but all of American culture continues to be so dependent on Britain over the course of the 19th century. So yeah, oh, I could talk about that for 100 years, but I don't think you want me to.
All right, our next question comes from Steve in Auburn, Alabama. Steve asks, can you say a bit about how the founders' interest in classicism informed their expression of Enlightenment thinking?
Sorry, how the founders' interest in what?
Classicism.
Like Greece and Rome?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Oh, I know a lot about that. And there's a bunch of wonderful books about it by colleagues of mine that I encourage you to look at. So yeah, the founders loved Greece and Rome. They just loved ancient Greece and Rome. You cannot exaggerate the degree to which they loved Greece and Rome. Rome more than Greece. They thought the Greeks were a little too democratic, licentious, and nude. They changed their views about that in the 19th century. But, you know, basically the way to understand the founders' love for ancient Rome is that today, you know, looking from 2020, we have a lot of examples of successful, long-lived republics, but they don't in 1776. They really don't. There's a few, like the English Civil War brings us a short-lived republic in the middle of the 17th century, but for the most part, it's a tale of woe and failure. By contrast, Rome survives as a republic for hundreds of years, and then it becomes this mighty empire. Well, how inspiring is that, you know, for people who have thrown off the largest empire in the history of the world since Rome, which is Britain, and they say, okay, we're going to found our little tiny republic along the lines of ancient Rome, and then look what Rome became. It became this globe-spanning empire, so that 1 in every 5 people in the ancient world lived in Rome. We want to do that too. So it's just this big, it's a big stage on which they can walk and learn all kinds of new things about themselves. There's a wonderful, so I've written a book on this. My colleague Carl Richard has also written several very good books about this, so I would encourage you to look at his work as well.
Our next question comes from Susan in Washington, D.C. Susan asks, do you see the First Great Awakening as a hostile reaction to the 18th century's Enlightenment, or more a movement occurring at the same time, appealing to a different demographic?
Yeah, you know, the First Great Awakening, this is one of those perennial problems in history. How do we teach the First Great Awakening? And is it indeed the first one? Because that implies that there's a second and third one, et cetera, et cetera. So I see the First Great Awakening as a kind of early manifestation of some of the new issues that are coming up with trying to reconcile religion and enlightenment. So how do we harness our faculties in new ways so as to approach the deity through nature? So Jonathan Edwards is an example of somebody trying to do that. But it's very, very early, and in some ways it's very, very limited. And things really get rolling, I would say, with the meeting of Enlightenment ideas and religion with what we call the Second Great Awakening, which, as you know, the asker of this question, Susan, will know that there's a huge debate about whether there is indeed a Second Great Awakening, et cetera. But I would definitely teach the First Great Awakening as an early kind of movement of enlightenment by a certain cadre of people.
Professor, we could talk for the rest of the afternoon, but we have time for one more question.
Okay.
And that will be coming from Dawn, who is a teacher from Syracuse, New York. And Dawn asks, you speak of the uncertainty of the American mindset. What universal truths, if any, did you find existed in the 18th century American worldview?
Wow, universal truths in the 18th century American worldview. So what I thought, what happened during the 18th century among people who strived, whatever the past tense of strive is, who strove for enlightenment, was that they glommed onto a series of new ideas, many of which we today take for granted as being so true that we no longer see them as ideological or as ideas that you could not have. And so of all of those, I would single out progress as the universal idea that many, many people in the 18th century came around to believing was a law of nature, you know, like a Newtonian law, you know, apples will fall to the ground, that the arc of history is not a decline from the Garden of Eden, nor is it a cyclical, you know, reenacting of historical events like the Greeks and Romans thought, but that in fact we are getting better all the time. And that if we are not getting better, we are somehow in violation of the law of United States history, which says that we must always be going ever upward. Look around. Next time you open the newspaper, look around for progress talk, as I call it, or try to debate someone about it. And don't say, you know, we're declining, just say that progress itself is a myth. That's a frame of understanding that was given to us in the 18th century that it's really hard to think outside of. So I would say, you know, it's when you're a historian, you become accustomed to the fact that there's no universals, right? That's for philosophers. Like, we're jealous of our colleagues in the philosophy department because they deal with these beautiful, you know, crystalline universals. We're in the mucky mess of history where everything is different and unique and idiosyncratic. But people in the 18th century across the Atlantic began to think that it was the lot of humanity to always get better, and that God was smiling on that project. And that is so new in human history, and it remains with us today as an unexamined truth. And yeah, I just found a lot of people who thought that in the 18th century.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. It has truly been a great pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you. This was really fun.
Yes, thank you, Professor Winter. I think I agree with Allison there. We could go on the whole day and just see the number of questions. This has generated a fantastic conversation. I'm going to share my screen one more time, everybody. And if you are interested in hearing more from Professor Winter, well, you're in for a treat if you are a teacher and are interested in pursuing a master's degree in American history. Applications are accepted on a rolling basis, and Professor Winter is one of the featured professors who will be teaching a course here coming up in this fall, the American Enlightenment. And lo and behold, Book Breaks has actually featured a lot of the people here teaching the course. So you guys have already gotten a sampling of what you will be in for if you decide to pursue this master's degree. The Fight for Women's Right with Catherine Clinton, she will be joining us the last week here in August. The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. with Peniel Joseph, who was on Book Breaks already. Lives of the Enslaved with Dinah Ramaberry, who was also here on Book Breaks already. So please go to the Gilder-Lehrman website and check out the MA in American History. For this amazing book by Professor Winter, American Enlightenments, if you're interested in purchasing it, and I highly recommend it, it is a fantastic read, please pop over to bookshop.org, the Gilder-Lehrman page. The link is right there. And after the program ends, you'll be taken to a site with just fill out this 2-minute survey. As every week, we always want to get your feedback, knowing how we can improve and what else you guys are interested in. Please join us next Sunday, August 23rd at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, when we're joined by Professor Martha Jones and her book, Vanguard. This book will be published in September, so you guys are in for kind of an early sneak preview treat on this book, so I hope you can join us next week. And for anything else you're interested in learning about the Gilder-Lehrman Institute, the Hamilton Education Program, future book break programs, please head over to the Gilder-Lehrman website. Professor Winter, thank you so much for this fantastic conversation today. Allison, thank you for corralling all those questions because there were dozens and dozens again. And the audience out there, thank you so much for joining us here again on Book Breaks. We're all going to shut our screens off, and I'm going to leave this one up for about 5 minutes or so if you want to write down the links. But the links were shared earlier in the chat, and you will also be sent a follow-up email with these links as well. So don't worry if you don't have time to write them down. So I'm wishing everyone a fantastic and lovely rest of their Sunday afternoon. Thank you so much, everyone.